What is going on, everyone? I hope you are all having a fantastic day. Needless to say, it has been a week filled with all kinds of news, with Democrats proposing their massive 1,800-page, $3 trillion HEROES Act that was supposed to be pre-negotiated, only to find out now that some Senate Republicans are calling this bill dead upon arrival. But instead of getting lost in the frustration of this entire situation, I want to look at the actual words that we've heard from both members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, as well as the White House, and use that data to make an educated prediction on what our future stimulus check could be. And on top of that, be sure you stick around to the end of the video where I'll give you 9 additional ways that you can get money from this HEROES Act if it does get passed, beyond those $1,200 direct payments. With that being said, be sure you subscribe and hit the like button if you do like today's video, and let's jump right into it. So earlier this week, we saw the HEROES Act come from House Democrats, which is really just a conglomeration of the dozens of different proposals we have seen over the past few weeks. On the surface, this bill includes another round of $1,200 direct payments to individuals, just like the first round from the CARES Act. However, there are a few minor changes that would now give dependents $1,200 instead of the $500 from the original CARES Act, and some other changes that may affect you. So if you want a full breakdown on that bill, then be sure to go ahead and check out my full video on the HEROES Act. So that $1,200 one-time payment might be a little frustrating to you, since a lot of the proposals that we talked about did have a $2,000 per month recurring payment. But as we talked about, those had a very low chance of actually passing, and we were led to believe that this act was actually pre-negotiated with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. However, as you may have heard, we have seen several Republican senators come forward saying that this bill is dead upon arrival, meaning that once the House passes it and it moves on to the Senate, it has no chance of passing the Senate regardless of what debates or alterations they make to it. And to anyone who's in dire need of that financial support right now, this is probably pretty frustrating to hear. But I promise we are not completely out of luck. First of all, remember that the voices of a few senators who happen to get in front of a microphone may not reflect the Senate majority as a whole. Now, after digging into the HEROES Act a little bit more, I will admit that some pretty substantial alterations will probably be necessary in order for this to get past the Senate. But calling this bill dead upon arrival only frustrates the American people even more and makes us feel like there's no sense of urgency coming out of Washington. So I've received a few questions about why this bill only includes a one-time $1,200 payment when the total cost of this bill is over $3 trillion, and the answer to that is pretty simple. They are literally throwing money in every direction. Here's a quick breakdown of the biggest chunks from the HEROES Act. The proposal would give $500 billion to state governments, $375 billion to local governments, $175 billion in increased testing funds and other health-related expenses, $75 billion for housing assistance, and a head-scratching $25 billion for the United States Postal Service. Now, if you happen to work for the Postal Service, I am not trying to offend you in any way, and I seriously do appreciate your hard work, especially during these challenging times. But I do have to question why the House had to include this very strange appropriation of money in a bill that is supposed to be geared towards pleasing both sides of the aisle so that it can get passed as fast as possible. Putting something like $25 billion for the US Postal Service in a crisis relief bill is only going to slow down the entire process, because Senate Republicans are going to look at that and debate why it shouldn't be in there, and Senate Democrats are going to debate why it should be in there, and this will only take up more time and delay when you get your stimulus check. So as you can see from that brief breakdown alone, the $1,200 direct payments are just a very small piece of this extremely expensive bill. And that is likely why Republicans in the Senate are saying that it is dead upon arrival, because it definitely has some loose ends that will probably need to be cut out in order for it to pass the Senate. The good news is that while this has received a lot of criticism from Senate Republicans, President Trump himself has made several remarks recently, making it clear that he now believes that another round of direct payments is needed. He hasn't commented specifically on the HEROES Act, but I'm assuming that the White House would agree that there is a little too much fluff in this proposal, but at least they are open to the idea of another round of stimulus checks. On top of that, our boy Jerome Powell over at the Federal Reserve did make a statement earlier this week warning of long-term economic damage if something is not done to support the individual American. So based on what we know so far, here's my best guess on how this will likely play out as it currently stands. The House is supposedly going to vote on the HEROES Act today, which is Friday, May 14th, 2020. But considering how long this bill is, it wouldn't surprise me if this got pushed into early next week. Again, this bill is 1,800 pages, and it took me several hours just to get through an abridged summary, so I can't imagine that every member of the House of Representatives will be prepared to vote today, but maybe they'll surprise us. It's unclear if the House will make any major alterations, but considering it's controlled by Democrats who proposed this bill, it'll probably move on to the Senate in a pretty similar form as what was originally proposed. And if what Senate Republicans are saying is true, then this bill will likely undergo heavy alterations and debates before it even has a chance of moving to the president's desk. The first and most likely alteration will probably be decreasing the funding for state governments, which currently accounts for $500 billion of this $3 trillion bill. While state governments are in dire need of financial support right now, $500 billion is a pretty crazy amount of money, not to mention the additional $375 billion for local governments. This means that nearly a third of the total cost of this bill would be for state and local governments alone, and we haven't even begun to address the needs of small businesses, corporations, and obviously individual Americans. So those numbers will probably be drastically reduced, and much of the fluff, such as the $25 billion for the US Postal Service that we talked about, will probably be removed entirely. I would love to see this bill on the president's desk by the end of the month, and while that may be an optimistic timeline, the frustration of the American people is building, and Congress can only push this down the road so far before causing irreversible economic damage due to a lack of stimulus. Although much of that fluff will probably be cut out in order to get this bill past the Senate, I've dug through the big sections of this proposal, and there are a lot of ways that you may be able to benefit from this beyond the $1,200 direct payments. The first is the mention of a tax cut at the state and local level, and while this wouldn't benefit you right now if you can't currently go to work because it's not safe to do so, this paired with the payroll tax cut that we've seen mentioned by the White House many times could lead to a substantial pay boost once it is safe for you to return to work. There's also increased funding for the EIDL grant as well as the EIDL loans, and if you have no idea what either of those are, then be sure to check out my video on the EIDL program, or Economic Injury Disaster Loans. But if you have a side hustle, or even if you're just a 1099 worker, then you likely may qualify for a $1,000 grant per employee, meaning you get to keep that money and do not have to pay it back. Obviously, the EIDL loan does need to be paid back, but it comes at a very low interest rate, and it could be a great way to keep yourself or your business afloat during these difficult times. There's also an increase of 15% for food stamps or the SNAP program. So if you are currently on food stamps, then you would see an increase for funding. And there's also another provision for student loan forgiveness on private loans this time, up to $10,000 per borrower. Now again, each of these points will be analyzed down to every detail, but each of these makes up a large portion of the HEROES Act as a whole. And while the numbers will likely change, it's very possible that the core concepts will remain. Now, as you may have heard, there has also been extensions to the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which is that $600 per week unemployment that came from the original CARES Act. This was originally supposed to end in midsummer of this year, but it has now been extended to January 31st of next year, and could go as far as March 31st of next year, depending on when you started claiming that $600 unemployment benefit. But remember, that is retroactive, so even if you haven't claimed yet, you can receive retroactive payments all the way back to when you originally lost your job or had your income affected. Now, this could be a good thing if you are currently on unemployment and receiving that $600 per week benefit, or it could be a very bad thing if you're one of the many employers who can't get your employees to come back to work since they are making more money on unemployment. But either way, this is in the HEROES Act, and it could affect you in one way or another if this does get passed. Beyond that, we have a hazard pay of $13 per hour up to $10,000 in total for essential workers, as well as emergency rental assistance for low-income tenants. So those are just a few of the ways that I found that you could get additional financial support out of this HEROES Act if it does indeed get passed. And if you want any additional information on any of those, then there is a link in the description to the full 1,800-page text if you do want to read that. So as you can see, the $1,200 payments just make up a small portion of the HEROES Act, and this massive bill really does incorporate many of the ideas from the dozens of proposals that we have seen over the past few weeks. Now again, I want to make it crystal clear that the HEROES Act is just a proposal, meaning it is not a bill that has been passed, and at this point it's really no different than the Emergency Money for the People's Act or any of the other proposals that we've looked at. The only difference with this bill is that it was proposed by some pretty big names in the House, meaning it will probably receive a lot more attention since it does encompass a lot of the ideas proposed by other members of Congress. While much of that fluff will probably be removed entirely by the Senate, it is very possible that those $1,200 payments will make it through. And while that's barely enough for most individuals, at least it's something, and I highly encourage you to look at every single one of those additional benefits that we just talked about to see if you may qualify for additional financial support. Remember that those direct payments are just a small part of all of this, and there are a lot of ways that you can find additional financial support right now depending on your current situation. So we'll see what happens today and see if the House passes the HEROES Act. But if anything, it's going to be a very interesting few weeks, so make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you stay up to date on exactly what's going on and when you can expect your next stimulus check. And remember to use the first link in the description for Webull to get your 2 free stocks, one of which is worth up to $1,400. And you'll also help support my channel, which I really appreciate. Don't forget to hit the like button if you did get value out of today's content, since that is a great way to support my small YouTube channel. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.